Hey guys, I'm back again to talk about chapter 14, objective number 5. I'm going to describe the evidence for the dopamine and glutamate hypotheses of schizophrenia. So without further ado, let's get right to it. There are two hypotheses, two different neurotransmitters, dopamine hypothesis and the glutamate hypothesis. And this is the idea that one of these neurotransmitters is primarily behind the problem of schizophrenia. So the dopamine hypothesis basically says that too much dopamine activity will cause the symptoms of schizophrenia. Now, I want you to be clear that that word activity is very important there, because people with schizophrenia do not have too much dopamine, but it looks like they have too much dopamine activity. Here is some evidence for that hypothesis. Number one, every single drug for schizophrenia blocks dopamine. Every single one. If it works, it blocks dopamine. The more it blocks dopamine, the more it works. The better it is against hallucinations, delusions, and stuff like that. Secondly, if you take amphetamine or cocaine, and you do it regularly, you can get a disorder called substance-induced psychotic disorder. That is the problem of increasing dopamine, because these addictive drugs increase dopamine hugely, okay? This disorder looks a lot like schizophrenia, which would lead us to believe that, in fact, schizophrenia has to do with increasing dopamine. So if you take enough cocaine or amphetamines, you can get hallucinations, you can get paranoid delusions, people checking in the windows and stuff like that, completely paranoid. And that happens with, with these drugs that increase dopamine. So again, that makes us think that there's a dopamine problem. On top of that, people with schizophrenia have twice the number of D2 receptors, so receptors for dopamine. So again, their dopamine levels are actually normal, but their brains are more sensitive to dopamine because they have so many receptors for dopamine. Let's take a look at a graph on that. Here you can see the normal person in blue and the schizophrenic person in red, and there you see the big difference, not so much in the D1 receptors, but definitely in the D2 receptors. So the second hypothesis is that is the glutamate hypothesis, and this is the idea that people with schizophrenia are suffering primarily from too little glutamate. And you say, well, how can we even have this with all the evidence for the dopamine hypothesis? Well, they're related, because what happens is that dopamine inhibits glutamate. So if you have a lot of dopamine, you have less glutamate. And what this hypothesis is saying is that the problem is not dopamine, the problem is glutamate, when you reduce glutamate to that amount. And so we do see that people with schizophrenia release less glutamate in the prefrontal cortex and also in the hippocampus. So we do see the evidence of less glutamate, which makes sense. More dopamine, less glutamate, right? But there's another interesting piece of evidence, and that is that there's a drug which is called PCP, and also known as angel dust on the street. It blocks glutamate receptors. And in fact, it produces a very good model of schizophrenia. It gives you both the positive symptoms and the negative symptoms of schizophrenia, whereas blocking dopamine, if you block dopamine, you end up only dealing with the positive symptoms of schizophrenia, not the negative ones. And increasing dopamine only gives you an increase in those positive symptoms. But even better, what's really interesting about PCP as a model of schizophrenia is that if you are a pre-adolescent, if you haven't reached adolescence, and you take PCP, it does nothing. So again, presumably these brain areas are not mature enough to react to that. So at any rate, there's another drug you might know about called ketamine, or Special K as it's known on the street. And it's very similar, does very similar things in terms of blocking glutamate receptors. Okay, I'm going to talk about some of the drug treatments for schizophrenia, and as you know by now, almost all of them are going to block dopamine. So we have the phenothiazines and the butyrophenones, and those are used to treat the positive symptoms of schizophrenia. That's all they treat. They block D2 receptors and they treat those positive symptoms. So if you've got problems with hallucinations, delusions, stuff like that, they're very good for that. They do also, however, block dopamine in other areas of the brain, such as the basal ganglia, which will produce some kind of tremors and some side effects, movement side effects that look a lot like Parkinson's disease. And that is a movement disorder that people on these drugs for a long time tend to get. It's a permanent disorder called tardive dyskinesia. And you get it in about 10% of the people who take these drugs in the long term. So unfortunately, the drugs are these are the older drugs, because some of the newer ones don't have that side effect, which is important. Okay, well, the second generation antipsychotics, there are a number of them, but probably the most positive is clozapine. And clozapine blocks dopamine and serotonin, and it increases glutamate. So again, the blocking of the dopamine in addition to increasing glutamate kind of handles both hypotheses. And there we treat the negative symptoms presumably from the glutamate, and the positive symptoms as well from the dopamine. We get less tardive dyskinesia, so none of these movement problems. There is a rare side effect of a decrease in white blood cells, which is very dangerous for the immune system. But a much more common side effect is weight gain and diabetes. Most patients are on these now. Most will complain about the weight gain, however. Well, that's all I have for this chapter. Hope you enjoyed the lecture, and study hard. Bye.